Okay, the game is In the Shadow of the Emperor. This is a game that Hello Gregor has already done, I think, very good coverage of already, in terms of the rules, in terms of some impressions of the game. I walked away with a pretty good understanding of it, but I bought it anyway because A, it was very cheap. It has hit kind of the bargain basement level, but also the subject matter is so interesting that, and it was a while since I saw his review and was totally discouraged. I mean, I had been totally discouraged by his review, and rightly so, I think, in terms of this actually representing what it's supposed to be about. Okay, but let's look at what you get. Well, I've set up part of the game. It'll handle 2 to 4 players. Now, I played this once already with my wife, and in a 2-player game, it really wasn't a big kick for us. I don't think it's bad as a 2-player game necessarily in comparison to anything else, but she didn't like kind of the decision cycle on it and how many different choices there were, none of which really seemed... it just felt like they threw a lot of decisions into this game without them being terribly interesting to her. For me, I'm more concerned, of course, about the historical side than anything else. Now here we have the pieces, and I always put... The first couple times I play something, I'll put it back in the tray. It's not working terribly well, and I've started just going straight to bags. But anyway, what you have is a set of knights, some barons of your color as well, and they will be marked with different values indicating their age. On the other side, let's pop one out. On the other side of the baron, and no, they're not that loose when you buy it. On the other side of that, you have a married couple of a baron and his wife. Okay. You have these little tokens, which essentially serve no purpose as far as I can see. This, which barely serves a purpose, it tells you the setup order, which, if you're going to be able to get it by reading this, I guess more power to you, but for the most part, the first few times at least you play, you're going to need to look at the rules for this. Now, the rules themselves are not good. They're not horrible in the sense that there's only so bad you can get with a fairly simple game. But they're in this kind of... they start out and they just tell you how to set the game up. Well, that's not useful until you know how to play and what you're trying to do, because, well, you have choices in setup. This isn't Monopoly, where setup is, hey, put your pieces on go and roll for who goes first. It's not that kind of game, right? You have all kinds of choices, as exemplified by this little sheet here. All right, so setup is the last thing we're going to go into here, and we're actually going to do that probably as part of the playthrough, because it is part of the play, in a sense. Setup ends up taking, and you have these 2-player aid cards, setup ends up taking the first 3 phases of the first turn. There's going to be 5 turns in this game, or 5 rounds, and this is the round marker, which confused my wife completely because she thought these were more round than that. But everybody starts with a pile of money, and that's also exemplified, expressed on this chart. Okay, now, what's your goal here? Well, your goal is to collect these victory point cards, and you get those victory point cards from this card. There's certain aspects of the game that happen. Some of them have to do with the election of the emperor. Some of them have to do with changing and taking power as an elector. Some of them have to do with putting your little city markers on the board. And some of them just fall to you. You can buy, there's cards that can give you these too. All right. So let's look at how the game actually is going to play. I'm going to go through what a regular turn is like. The first turn isn't like this. The first 3 steps don't happen on the first turn. But that's okay. Every other turn happens this way. In the first turn of the game, you start with $7. In every other turn, you start with $6, and one for each city that you have on the board, and one for each city, and those will be placed like this, and one for each city that you have on the board. Let's show you an example. If you have an electorate here, which is signified by having a baron up in that space, if someone else has a city there, you also get a point for that one. What you don't seem to get a point for is these imperial cities. You can't tax them. Because they're imperial, of course. Okay. And, you know, that's perfectly reasonable. So there's little bits like this that kind of feel like they make sense. But the underlying sort of spirit of the game is where it fails historically to me. Okay. And it's really a let's design this, but then let's make it into a Euro. If they had made this into a simulation along the lines that they were starting to go, even with some of the Euro-ish aspects, it could have been really, really interesting. But the problem is, the game wouldn't work as a game anymore. It wouldn't have that tight cycle anymore. It would be boring old history or something, I guess. All right. And then the final thing is the Elector of Saxony has a special ability. Every Elector has a special ability let's say this is the Elector of Saxony. When he takes this ability, it moves here and indicates it's been taken. In this case, the ability is kind of automatic. It happens in phase 1, and it gives him 2 extra bucks. And green would just record extra bucks for that. Okay. When you set your money there, then you're supposed to set your little disc. And I have no idea why you do this, but if blue's money is at 7, their little disc shows up at 7. Now, money carries over from turn to turn, and this disc doesn't seem to serve any purpose at all, from what I can see. It may have been a carryover from some other rule where you were tracking income or something. It isn't happening now, though. And it just seems to be this pointless piece in the game. Okay. The next thing you do is aging. All right, well, each of these barons... Okay. So the game just got weird to me. So aristocrats are defined as barons and couples, these things, right here, very clearly. Elsewhere in the game, it seems to make these aristocrat spaces as distinct from elector spaces. And this is kind of interesting because it means that things that my wife and I were doing were wrong. This is the only place this is defined. But elsewhere, there seems to be a distinction between whether someone's an aristocrat, an elector, or the emperor. And those are handled differently in different places. So, what's interesting here, they use a bad switch between the rules. And I told you the rules are kind of difficult and painful here. Well, let's take a look at the rule for the doctor who reduces the life stage of one of his aristocrats. Now, what we've just found is this and this are aristocrats no matter where they're located. When my wife and I played, an aristocrat had to be in a yellow space. Okay? So the doctor can't help electors and the emperor. I can see or poison them. I can see reasons for this. But that's okay. Primarily because when an aristocrat turns from 45 to 15, it's returned to the supply to the owner, which would mean there would be no emperor. Now, there are rules for what happens when the emperor dies of old age, and I would just consider applying those, which is a new old emperor shows up to take his place, basically. But let's take a look at this other one. The Archdiocese of Cologne may reduce the life stage of one of his barons or couples by 1 life stage. So it seemed like there was a distinction in wording, and Elsewhere in the game, these are referred to as aristocrat spaces, these elector spaces, this the emperor's space. And I did not see where this was actually defined as an aristocrat. Now, maybe I had at some point. So this is kind of interesting and is going to affect things. All right. So, and yes, this is the kind of analysis you have to put this rule book through. It's like a Games Workshop game to figure out what they intended to mean by these rules, because they're not well, nobody did the proper checking on them. They made sure they were all kind of nice colored places and everything, which don't really help at all. Another gripe about the game, these cards, yeah, once you read the rules and get used to playing them, maybe they get kind of familiar, but when I look at this and this, you know, the symbols on here, they're not clear and easy to read. It would be nice to have some text. I understand language independence. Well, there's a cost to it. There's a cost to it. You want to make the same components work in Germany as work in the US and England? Well, I mean, you got to reprint the rules anyway. I can understand the board's expensive, but a deck of cards, you could probably afford to put some text on each of them. I don't know. But it does make it easier if somebody goes to Essen or something, so they can just print out the rules and they have all the cards they need. All right, let's look at the next thing. So after aging, well, what aging happens is that a character moves from, say, 15 to 25, and the same would happen with a couple. Once you hit 45, if you age at that point, you die. And you're removed, well, no, I'm sorry, the rules won't say you die. You're placed back in the player's stock. But, I mean, theoretically, you're dying, right? Okay. Now, there's special rules on the Emperor reaching old age and this stage. In which case, the Emperor takes one of his aristocrats from the board, the player, and places it on the throne. It can't be an Elector. Strangely enough, quite often, you saw people, say, who held the Electorate of Bohemia sitting on the imperial throne. The Elector of Saxony, the Elector of the Palatinate. These were people who were in contention for the imperial honors. So right away, here I'm having you should be able to do that. Would kind of damage the game if you could, though. Okay? But we're throwing the history away. If anyone should be able to be the emperor, it should be one of the secular electors should be able to go up to the emperor. The idea of making an archbishop into the emperor, that would be impossible, I would say. And I would have no objection to removing that. But who's in the church and who's not isn't very clear. Basically, the archbishop is chosen, very oddly, and we'll see this in a bit, from a secular baron, possibly, within that diocese. Well, he can't be married. That's the only effect. All right, let's keep going. So here it has specific rules on how to deal with the emperor dying in this phase of old age, but it doesn't specify what happens if the emperor dies of old age at any other time. And would the same effects take place? Is it just empty? Does it make a difference? It definitely makes a difference which one you want to deal with it as. If it's just empty, well, the game probably is broken. So I think you have to do it. But the fact that this brought a question and that wasn't handled led me to maybe you can't age the emperor. Well, obviously you can. You could do it with the Cologne diocese. So you obviously, being able to do it with the doctor isn't that much of a difference. All right, let's keep going. And yes, this is taking forever, and you're not going to get your rules explanation only out of this. Because when I'm facing something this annoying, I'm giving you the playthrough of the rules reading. All right. Now here's something interesting. This is the Descendants phase. This is the cute, clever thing in the game. You've got these pink and blue cards. You pick these up as actions, as you do in some other Euro-type games, where, oh yeah, I want to do that. Think Puerto Rico, where you get to choose to do something. Well, in this, you are the only person who gets to choose to do it, and we'll explain how the actions themselves are picked and used, But what's interesting is whichever cards you have in front of you, if you have none, you have no children. If you have more blue than pink, you get a boy child. And you get a 15-year-old single person that you can place pretty much anywhere in the Empire. This is also kind of disturbing. You're not, there's no inheritance here. There's no... Just the fact that you had an heir allows you to grab an area. It doesn't make sense. So the link of child being, of age or whatever, and, oh look, I got more territory, more power, whatever. That's not really a clear one that makes any sense to me. But, again, it's a gaming mechanic. So what happens if you don't have more blues? What happens if you have as many or more pinks? Well, now you have a girl. And a girl may or may not be, it may not be a bad thing. I would say getting an extra one of these is good, but you have a limited supply of them. You only have, 3, 6, 7 of these total. And in the 2-player game, at least, I ran out. So there might be times when you don't even want a boy. And if you have a girl, you have 2 options. One is you can turn her in for money, because of course females can be sold. Supposedly you're sending her off to a convent. I'm not sure what you're actually doing. But anyway, you get money for her. Great. The other option, though, is you could offer her to an unmarried male who's not sitting in a diocese, I assume. I didn't look at that. It had better be. See, here it doesn't specify an unmarried baron, and it doesn't say you can't send her off to go marry the bishop. I don't know, when there's no historical basis in a game like in this one, when it's not strongly tied, I don't know what they mean. I can't use common sense in this game because it's not linked to common sense and reality. It's linked to gaming mechanics. So when the rules are at all questionable in a game that doesn't link to reality clearly, I can't say, oh yeah, this is what you should do. I can guess. But yeah, they left that out. Should it be there? I don't know. But by the rules as written, I can go marry the bishop here. And that's not a problem. Unless he gets removed from office, he can't go back up. And I don't know, which way I'm going to play it when I do the playthrough. Okay. So now, I'll probably try to use common sense, but you can't use common sense in games. So, when you marry them to a person, when you marry your little daughter off to maybe some 45-year-old lord near the end of his life, you still get a bonus. The guy who accepts it gets a bonus, but you get a victory point. And remember, victory points are what you're looking to win the game. If he doesn't accept it and you only get one choice to pawn her off, then you get the buck that you would have gotten if you didn't offer her up anyway. So no matter what, you get something out of a daughter. The question is, do you want a buck? A buck is useful. A victory point is very useful because, look, it costs you $2 to get a victory point and a jump on that card and stuff like that. Okay. So that's your Descendants phase. And everybody gets that once. Everybody gets each of these phases once. And they're done in order from the Emperor around the table. Okay. Now comes the hard part. This is the action stage. This is where you're actually choosing these cards. And to do this, of course, you need an explanation of what each card does. All right. But let's take a quick look at some of them. I'm going to leave the voting ones away for a little bit. This one, you pay $2 to pick this card. So this is the basic action. You pay the cost, you grab the card, you get the action. And in this case, the action would be, I get a victory point card. Great. This one, you pay $1, you can change somebody's age by in one direction, positive or negative. So you can make him younger, or in this case, because he's 45, you can remove him from the board. This one, you get to bring a new, no, that's not it. You get to move a baron, married or otherwise, from, and here's, you got to look these up, because how are these worded, right? Baron or couple moves their seat to a different electorate. The player must move one of his aristocrats, not an elector or the emperor. So they're pretty clear what an aristocrat is. Although I read these not an elector or the emperor as, okay, those ain't aristocrats maybe. To the aristocrat space of his choice in a different electorate, to another yellow space. So basically you must go from a yellow space, an aristocrat space, you kind of see where I got this error, right? To a different one. Okay, now there's an issue with when you move to a different electorate. If that electorate is filled with other people's stuff, or your stuff, what the heck? Obviously there's no room there. But it's possible that there's just a knight here. And if that area is filled with just a knight, you can shift that knight off into a castle. If there's no room for the castle, you can shift that knight off the board. Knights are kind of precarious when they're sitting in aristocrat spaces, which they're allowed to be in. There are advantages for them to be in, very slight ones, but they have this weakness, which is if the castles are filled up, or if there are none, like in Trier, they could be knocked off the board. Okay. All right. Let's hold off on these. This one says marry a foreign princess for $2. You get to flip a male over to a couple, and you end up getting 2 towers instead of 1, which is the bonus of being married. This one says, put a new noble, a new aristocrat on the board at age 15, and it costs you $3 if you want an unmarried one, and $5 if you want a married couple. This one's a special ability which is limited to the Marquis of Brandenburg. We'll get to that in a bit. This one is just a placeholder. Anytime you want during the action phase, you can pay $1 and get a new knight, and you place him on the board. And he can be placed in an empty aristocrat space or an empty castle. Anywhere. This one, for $4, you get to place one of your cities in an empty city space. Cities do a few things. They provide you for votes, as do the nobles, but in the electoral elections, as it were, but they also provide you with income. They give you 1 income on your turn for owning a city, and if someone else owns the electorate that they sit in, that person gets $1 as well. This one, this is why it's useful to have a knight sitting in an aristocrat space. If there is a knight in an aristocrat space, you can pay $2 to turn him into a young aristocrat. Great. These other ones, this one's the trickiest. This one, for $1, you can say any one of these secular electorates is under an excommunication ban. And this actually takes effect over in the elections itself. That electorate cannot cast any votes in the imperial elections. This one, for $2, says you pick a religious electorate, and I think it's got to be one you own, by the way. No, you can pick whichever one you like. Now, it gives additional votes to the player who controls that electorate, equal to the number of aristocrats and knights that they have kicking around in that electorate. So that can be very powerful. It could also be worth nothing if you only control the elector at the time of the elections, which is possible. Over here, this one's just a buck. It gives you a vote from the Pope in the electorate, in the imperial elections. Here's what's tricky, though. The church influence and the excommunication, it might behoove, well, no, they can't affect each other, so it's not that big a deal. All right, so they're chosen, like with everything else, in turn order, which comes from the emperor, and then normally clockwise around the board. I'm going to cut this and come back to the rest of the turn order. Okay, so let's keep going. I think we looked at all the cards. Not quite. We still got this one. This one's very interesting. So the way you pick these cards, you alternate grabbing one, paying for it, grabbing one, paying for it. Some of them take effect immediately. They say phase 4 on them. When you do them, when you buy them, you just take effect with the cards. Others have effects at different times. In particular, some of them are in the election phase. This one also is in the election phase, but when you draw this one, you pay nothing, but you may not draw any further cards. Your turn has just ended. You can pass, and that has the same effect. But this one says, I am going to contest the election, which means you can't, this is not specified in the rules, but the game would not work if it was attempted. The emperor cannot take this, but anyone else can pick it up. And it says, I'm going to be the guy contesting this the next imperial election. So, since there's value to being the emperor, there's a desire to grab this. But there are other things you can do which can get you points, which are valuable, which are important, which maybe you need to do before you do this. In a 2-player game, this card loses all its interest. Because basically both players play it out as long as they can. Of course, in a 2-player game, there may be more advantages to being the emperor. We'll see how that plays out in a 4-player game. In terms of being able to choose ties, etc., because it's always you versus someone else, right? There's no deal breaking. There's nothing to add spice to this game in the 2-player game. It's still a good game. I still think it's an interesting and good game. But, well, my wife didn't like it at all as a game, and I am disturbed by the other factors. All right. So, let's find this little thing. After everyone has done all the actions they want to, and really, you've got a fairly limited amount available to you. Your money can only go as high as 12 ever. And many of these actions cost something. Well, then we're going to go to the electors. But before we go to choosing the electors, let's take a look at what some of the special powers for some of these electors are. All right? So, start from the top. We're going to take a look at the ones for phase 4 first. This one says, I can, and these are always marked by moving the elector over the special ability. He moves from his elector box to the special ability to say he used it this turn. So this first one here is a little gray card, and what that says is I can take any card that's triggered in phase 4, whether somebody else has it or not, or I have it already. I can use it again, okay? I can spend it as though I had just picked it up. I don't get a physical card for that. It doesn't affect my children, but I do get to take the ability. So, for example, I could always spend 2 gold for a victory point, even if somebody else has already done that. Or I could age someone, or whatever. Alright, this next one here is like the Doctor. Once in phase 4, instead of drawing a card, I can shift this and I can age or make someone more youthful. We'll skip this one for now. Over here, Caddy Palatine of the Rhine. He's just very capable of spawning, it seems. He slides here, he creates a new 15-year-old person that he can place anywhere. Any historical basis to these? Not for the most part. We've already hit the Saxons. They get $2 in the income phase, and they mark that just the same way. This is the one with any sort of historical flavor maybe to it, the Marquess of Brandenburg. When he slides, he can pick up this special card. This special card is going to take effect in phase 5, the electoral phase, coming right up. But he has to spend an action to pick this up. That action to pick this up might prevent him from getting this. In the 2-player game, it was no big deal. It's a cool ability. But in Mar, it does actually slow down your electoral, your imperial desires. Now, why do I say this one's one with some historical significance? Well, this is called the Grey Eminence. It allows you to kind of infiltrate and put power in other places. And the Great Elector was reputed and given that title. He was claimed to have a more powerful spy network, etc. But, and yes, he was of Brandenburg. He didn't oversee a period of changing emperors very much. Well, there may not be that many. Okay. I mean, there's 5 rounds, but one person lives for 4 of those rounds. So it really is the lifetime of one noble. A little bit longer than that. Okay. Let's look at some of the others, though. This one, when it comes... Oh, let's go up to this one. On phase 5, you shift over, and you get a victory point card. Pretty simple. Bohemia, during the voting phase, most provinces are worth 1 vote. Well, the King of Bohemia has 2 votes. Any sense to that? Not that I can think of. Now, there were times when there might be multiple electorates being held by a single person. So, for example, at the beginning of the 30 Years' War, the owner, the Count of the Palatine, also had a claim to the Bohemian electorate, and I don't think anybody ever voted for emperor during that period. I believe you had one emperor throughout that entire time period. That's the only thing I can see with this. I don't see any reason why the Kingdom of Bohemia is given more voting power. The truth of the matter is there's 7 electors. It's that simple. There's no other votes involved in anything. If those 7 electors, and those electors were not, they were generally being bribed into swinging one way or another. But that's onto the historical analysis of this situation. And the game fails very heavily there. Okay. And that's what saddens me, because that's what I wanted to investigate. Not, let's put a Euro concept, some Euro mechanics on something that's vaguely themed about this. That doesn't intrigue me at all. Okay. But I knew that when I bought it, so blame me. Let's look at the other one. No, that's all of them. All right. So now we go on to choosing electors. Well, choosing electors is simply a matter of counting towers. Now here's where the rules, again, are ambiguous, and I'm not using common sense here. The way the rules are stated for this, let's see, because I might be wrong. In each electorate, you tally the power points of each player. This is shown by points from knights, cities, and for aristocrats. Well, now that we see that the elector is an aristocrat, we can count his votes into it. But the way my wife and I were playing, we weren't counting the elector themselves as having any votes. So pushing someone into the electorate meant that some of these would swing every turn just because, you know, as soon as you elected someone, you had less votes, less power, so you were less likely to be the elector. Okay, anyway, the elector does count for that. So what we're going to be looking at is counting the number of total little towers that players hold. And that's how many votes they have in that electorate. And whoever has the most will win the electorate. You don't form coalitions within electorates. So couples give you 2 votes, individuals give you 1, knights give you 1, cities give you 1. Imperial cities, you'll see how they happen, give the emperor a point in that electorate. And of course, now that we found out, whoever's sitting up here has one as well. So whoever has the largest number wins the electorate. Okay, what if it's a tie? Well, whoever's the current elector gets to keep it. No, I lied. If there's a tie, the emperor, yeah, I remember this, and this is the power in the 2-player game. The emperor gets to choose which person is the electorate. Now, this is probably meant to represent sort of, there were appeals to the emperor at times over conflicting rights to an electorate. But in this game, you're going to see way too tight a cycle of this. These were rare occasions where the emperor would come in and make this decision. And I think, and very rare where an electorate would just change, an elector would just be deposed and someone else come in and replace them without the emperor making a choice. So basically, this game has, this whole mechanic here is completely irrelevant in terms of being connected to history. What would normally happen is an emperor would be called in a dispute. If the current and presumably accepted in terms of, the imperial will, elector is being challenged by someone who maybe has, family claims that make them appear a better candidate for the electorate, then the emperor might just choose. Whether or not the emperor's choice held was another issue, because that could also devolve into some sort of war or something. How often did that happen? Not bloody often. Not in one person's lifetime across several electorates, okay? And then there's the special case of the County Palatine of the Rhine having his electorate stripped from him and given to the King of Bavaria. Very special case, and it had nothing to do with how much support the Count had in the Palatinate. It had to do with the fact that the emperor had enough power to say, you ain't the elector anymore. So, I do not see any example, any historical relevance to what's going on in this game. Unless the cycle was stretched out tremendously, then there might be some, but it still happens too often. All right, anyway. let's look at these rules. So you're only able to remove an elector if you're eligible for that electorate. So for example, in this situation, say yellow has 2 votes for the electorate. Say the emperor's not really involved here, and green has 1, or 1 point of power. Well, yellow would be eligible in terms of power to take over the electorate, but green, yellow only has a couple. They don't have someone, and the only person who's eligible in a religious electorate is someone who's single, and you can't just throw a knight up there. This would be allowed. Let's say yellow was the emperor here. He would be able to replace green, and green would fall back to being just in an aristocrat space. In this event, however, green would fall back to an aristocrat space, but yellow wouldn't get to advance, and that electorate would remain empty. Now, if the elector has to come back and there's no empty aristocratic space, he can push away a knight. If he can't push away a knight, he goes back to his pool. All right. Now, when you first obtain an electorate, you get this bonus of getting 2 victory points. You don't get it for staying elector. You don't get it for deposing an elector if you don't rise up. All right. And that's done for every electorate in order. Then we go to the imperial election. And the imperial election is essentially each player can vote for either the current emperor or the holder of the alternative card. Now, this is done secretly. Everybody places their hand down over their card, and they have a number of votes equal to the number of electorates they hold, with Kingdom of Bohemia holding 2 votes, plus anything generated from these cards. Not all electorates are going to vote, which may be the reason why some of those cards and effects might make some sense, but if all electorates are full, it really doesn't. There were 7 electors, plain and simple, at most times. There were times when there were 6, etc., but this feels like it's meant to cut just one person's lifetime, so we're going to say there were 7 electors at that point. Okay. So, what happens? Whoever has the most votes of the 2 people becomes the emperor. You don't get any bonus immediately for becoming the emperor. The other person, well, if it's the current emperor, they just sit up there. If it's a new emperor, they take the throne, and the emperor can come down to any electoral, any aristocratic space of their choice. And if the electorate they're in doesn't have anything but knight, it has all its spaces filled, they can push a knight out of the way. They can't choose one to push an aristocrat out of the way. You never can do that. Okay. And then we go to the spoils, essentially, which is the emperor action. For the emperor action, you get to do something based on what turn it is of the game. On the first turn, you get 2 victory points, and you get to place one of these imperial cities anywhere on the board. Second turn, same thing. Third turn, you get 2 victory points, you get a buck, and you get to move an imperial city from one location to another. Fourth turn, 1 victory point, 2 bucks. Fifth turn, just a victory point. It becomes less valuable to be the emperor. The catch-up mechanic in this game, sort of in reverse. It's a negative catch-up mechanic. The game becomes harder to stockpile points. So you're not going to see a big swing, which is fine because this isn't a game where you can stockpile power or anything like that. The only thing you can put together is people on the board and money. Now, people on the board is the thing that's potent, though, and there isn't a lot of ability to remove that kind of power. On the other hand, there isn't a lot of ability to lose it early on. So everybody should be fairly equal. The only targeting is the aging and the couples and stuff like that, and that's limited by your money, so we'll see how that kind of plays out. Then you move the round marker, or the game ends. If we're here, the game ends. What happens when the game ends? You count your victory points. It's that simple. All right, let's take a look to see. There's no tiebreaker there? All right. 2 and 3 player game, the game is a little different. In the 3 player game, you remove some of these actions. Same thing in the 2 player game, but in addition, some of the electorates disappear. In particular, one spiritual and one secular are out of the game, which changes the game significantly. And they're picked at random, essentially. Oh, yes, there is another rule in the selection of action cards that I forgot to mention. You kind of must use your action cards when you buy them. In the 2 player game, you're allowed to buy them without using them, just to deny someone the option to use it. How much sense does that make? Not a lot, but there might be ones that you can't use. So, for example, if you bought, I don't know, the Royal Marriage and all your couples, you had only couples on the board, then that would be illegal in 3 or more players because you're just depriving the card of other people. But in 2 players, you're allowed to do that. All right, that's about it. Yeah, this took a lot longer than the complexity of the game, but the game actually is tough to go through everything because of this procedural rule book that basically says, you do this, you do that, you do that. So it's hard to capture what you're trying to do from it and distill that easily. There's also a lot of flaws in the rulebook, but I spent about half the time ranting about stuff. Hey, welcome to my world. Okay, this is going up.